to Armstid. But time I give him another sup of whiskey, and supper was about ready. He had then already bought a team from somebody on the credit. Picking and choosing he were by then, saying how he didn't like this span and wouldn't put his money in nothing so and so owned, not even a hen coop. You mighty try Snopes, I said. He's got 3/4 span, maybe one of them would suit you. Then he begun to mumble his mouth, looking at me like was me that owned the only span of mules in the country and wouldn't sell them to him. When I knew that like as not it would be my team that would ever get them out of the lot at all. Only I don't know what they would do with them if they had a team. Little John had told me that the levee through Haley Bottom had done gone for 2 miles and that the only way to get to Jefferson would be to go around by Motson. But that was Auntie's business. He's a he's a close man to trade with, he says, mumbling his mouth. But when I give him another sup after supper, he cheered up some. He was aiming to go back to the barn and set up with her. Maybe he thought that if he just stayed down there ready to take out, Santa Claus would maybe bring him a span of mules. But I reckon I can talk him around, he says. A man'll always have a fallow in a tight if he's got a drop of Christian blood in him. Of course you're welcome to the use of mine, I said, me knowing how much he believed that was the reason. I thank you, he said. She'll want to go in Orne, and him knowing how much I believed that was the reason. After supper, Jewel rode over to the bend to get Peabody. I heard he was to be there today at Barner's. Jewel come back about midnight. Peabody had gone down below Inverness somewhere, but Uncle Billy come back with him, with his satchel of horse physic. Like he says, a man ain't so different from a horse or a mule. Come short. Except a mule or a horse has got a little more sense. What you been into now, boy? He says, looking at Cash. Get me a mattress and a chair and a glass of whiskey, he says. He made Cash drink the whiskey, then he run Antsy out of the room. Lucky it was the same leg he broke last summer, Antsy says, mournful, mumbling and blinking. That's something. We folded the mattress across Cash's legs and set the chair on the mattress, and me and Jewel sat on the chair, and the gal held the lamp, and Uncle Billy taking a chew of tobacco and went to work. Cash fought pretty hard for a while until he fainted. Then he laid still with big balls of sweat standing on his face like they had started to roll down, and then stopped to wait for him. When he waked up, Uncle Billy had done packed up and left. He kept on trying to say something until the gal leaned down and wiped his mouth. It's his tools, she said. I brought them in, Darl said. I got them. He tried to talk again. She leaned down. He wants to see them, she said, so Darl brought them in where he could see them. They shoved them under the side of the bed where he could reach his hand and touch them when he felt better. Next morning, Antsy taking that horse and rode over to the bend to see Snopes. Him and Jewel stood in the lot talking a while, then Antsy got on the horse and rode off. I reckon that was the first time Jewel ever let anybody ride that horse, and until Antsy come back, he hung around in that swole-up way, watching the road like he was half a mind to take out after Antsy and get the horse back. Along toward 9 o'clock, it begun to get hot. That was when I see the first buzzard because of the wedding, I reckon. Yeah, the body. Anyway, it wasn't until well into the day that I seen them. Lucky the breeze was setting away from the house, so it wasn't until well in the morning, but as soon as I see them, it was like I could smell it in the field a mile away from just watching them, and them circling and circling for everybody in the county to see what was in my barn. I was still a good half a mile from the house when I heard that boy yelling. I thought maybe he might have fell into the well or something, so I whipped up and come into the lot on the lope. There must have been a dozen of them setting along the ridge pole of the barn, and that boy was chasing another one around the lot like it was a turkey, and it just lifting enough to dodge him and go flopping back to the roof of the shed again where he had found it setting on the coffin. It had got hot then, right, and the breeze had dropped or changed or something, so I went and found Jewel Balula come out. You gotta do something, she said. It's an outrage. That's what I aim to do, I said. It's an outrage, she said. He should be lauded for treating her so. He's getting her into the ground the best he can, I said. So I found Jewel and asked him if he didn't want to take one of the mules and go over to the bend and see about Antsy. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me with his jaws going bone white and them bone white eyes of his, and then he went and begun to call Darl. What are you fixing to do, I said. He didn't answer. Darl, come out. Darl come out. Come on, Jewel said. What you aim to do, Darl said. Going to move the wagon, Jewel said over his shoulder. Don't be a fool, I said. I never meant nothing, you couldn't help it. And Darl hung back too, but nothing wouldn't suit Jewel. Nothing wouldn't suit Jewel. Shut your goddamn mouth, he says. It's gotta be somewhere, Darl said. We'll take out soon as Pa gets back. You won't help me, Jewel says. Then white eyes of his and kind of blaring in his face, shaking like he had a Agur? A-G-U-E-R. No, Darrell said, I won't. Wait till Pa gets back. So I stood in the door and watched him push and haul out the wagon. It was on a downhill, and once I thought he was fixing to beat out the back end of the shed. Then the dinner bell rung. I called him, but he didn't look around. Come to dinner, I said. Tell that boy, but he didn't answer, so I went on to dinner. The gal went down to get that boy, but she come back without him. About half through dinner, we heard him yelling again, running that buzzard out. It's a outrage, Lula said. A outrage. He's doing the best he can, I said. If Fallow don't trade with Snopes in 30 minutes, they'll sit in the shade all afternoon to dicker. Do? She says, do? He's done too much already. And I reckon he had. Trouble is his quitting was just about to start our doing. He couldn't buy no team from nobody, let alone Snopes. Without when he had something to mortgage he didn't know would mortgage yet. And so when I went back to the field, I looked at my mules and same as old. And I looked at my mules and same as told them goodbye for a spell. When I come back that evening and the sun shining all day on that shed, I wasn't so sure I would regret it. He come riding up just as I went out to the porch where they all was. He looked kind of funny, kind of more hang dog than common, and kind of proud too. Hang dog, H-A-N-G-D-O-G. Hang dog, that common, and kind of proud too, like he had done something he thought was cute, but wasn't so sure now how other folks would take it. I got a team, he said. You bought a team from Snopes, I said. I reckon Snopes ain't the only man in the country that can drive a trade, he said. Sure, I said. He was looking at Joel with that funny look, but Joel had done got down from the porch and was going toward the horse to see what Antsy had done to it, I reckon. Joel, Antsy says. Joel looked back. Come here, Antsy, says. Joel come back a little and stopped again. What you want, he said. So you got a team from Snopes, I said. He'll send them over tonight, I reckon. You want an early start tomorrow, as long as you'll have to go by Matson. Then he quit looking like he had been for a while. He got that badger look like he used to have, mumbling in his mouth. I do the best I can, he said, for God. If there were a man in the living world suffered the trials and floutings I have suffered. A fellow that just beat Snopes in a trade ought to feel pretty good, I said. What did you give him, Nancy? He didn't look at me. I give a chattel mortgage on my cultivator and cedar, he said. But they ain't worth $40. How far do you aim to get with the $40 team? They were all watching and all quiet and steady. Joel was stopped halfway back, waiting to go on to the horse. I give other things, Nancy said. He began to mumble his mouth again, standing there like he was waiting for somebody to hit him. And him with his mind already made up not to do nothing about it. What other things, Darrell said. Hell, I said, you take my team, you can bring them back. I'll get along some way. So that's what you were doing in Cash's clothes last night, Darrell said. He said it just like he was reading it out in the paper. Like he never give a darn himself one way or another. Joel had come back now, standing there, looking at Antsy with them marble eyes of his, and Cash aimed to buy that talking machine from Stewart with that money. Cash aimed to buy that talking machine from Surratt with that money, Darrell said. Antsy stood there, mumbling his mouth. Joel watched him. He ain't never blinked yet. But that's just $8 more, Darrell said in that voice like he was just listening and never give a darn himself. That still won't buy a team. Antsy looked at Joel quick, kind of sliding his eyes that way. Then he looked down again. God knows if there were a man, he says. Still, they didn't say nothing. They just watched him waiting and him sliding his eyes toward their feet and up their legs, but no higher. And the horse, he says. What horse, Joel said. Antsy just stood there. I'd be darned if a man can't keep the upper hand of his sons. He ought to run them away from home, no matter how big they are. And if he can't do that, I'd be darned if he oughtn't to leave himself. I'd be darned if I wouldn't. You mean you tried to swallow my horse, Joel said, as he stands there, dangle arm. For 15 years, I ain't had a tooth in my head, he says. God knows it. He knows in 15 years I ain't at the victuals he aimed for a man to eat to keep his strength up, and me saving a nickel here and a nickel there so my family wouldn't suffer it, to buy them teeth so I could eat God's appointed food. I give that money, I thought that if I could do without eating, my sons could do without riding. God knows I did. Joe stands with his hands on his hips, looking at Antsy. Then he looks away. He looked out across the field, his face still as a rock, like it was somebody else talking about somebody else's horse, and him not even listening. Then he spit slow and said, hell. And he turned and went onto the gate and unhitched the horse and got on it. It was moving when he come into the saddle, and by the time he was on it, they was tearing down the road like the law might have been behind them. They went out of sight that way, the two of them looking like some kind of a spotted cyclone. Well, I says, you take my team, I said, but he wouldn't do it, and they wouldn't even stay, and that boy chasing them buzzards all day in the hot sun till he was nigh as crazy as the rest of them. Leave Cash here anyway, I said, but they wouldn't do that. They made a pallet for him with quilts on top of the coffin and laid him on it and set his tools by him. And we put my team in and hauled the wagon about a mile down the road. If we'll bother you here, Nancy says, just say so. Sure, I said, it'll be fine here, safe too. And let's go back and eat supper. I thank you, Nancy said. We got a little something in the basket we can make out. Where'd you get it? I said, we brought it from home. But it'll be stale now, I said. Come on and get some hot victuals. Victuals, Victuals. But they wouldn't come. I reckon we can make out, Nancy said. So I went home and ate and taking a basket back to them and tried again to make them come back to the house. I thank you, he said. I reckon we can make out. So I left them there squatting around a little fire waiting. God knows what for. I come on home, I kept thinking about them there and about that fellow tearing away on that horse, and that would be the last they would see of him. And I'd be darned if I could blame him. Not for wanting to not give up his horse, but for getting shut of such a darn fool as Ansi. Or that's what I thought then, because be darned if there ain't something about a darn fellow like Ansi that seems to make a man have to help him even when he knows he'll be wanting to kick himself next minute. Because about an hour after breakfast next morning, Eustace Grimm, that works Snopes' place, come up with a span of mules hunting Ansi. I thought him and Ansi never traded, I said. Sure, Eustace said. All they liked was the horse. Like I said to Mr. Snopes, he was letting this team go for $50 because if his uncle Flem had just kept them Texas horses when he owned them, Ansi wouldn't have never. The horse, I said. Ansi's boy taking that horse and cleared out last night, probably halfway to Texas by now. And Ansi? I didn't know who brung it, Eustace said. I never see them. I just found the horse in the barn this morning when I went to feed, and I told Mr. Snopes, and he said to bring the team on over here. Well, that'll be the last they'll ever see of him now, sure enough. Come Christmas time, they'll maybe get a postal card from him in Texas, I reckon. And if it hadn't been Joel, I reckon it'd have been me. I owe him that much myself. I'd be darned if Ansi don't conjure a man some way. I'd be darned if he ain't a sight. Alright, that was the end of Whitfield, right? Yeah, Whitfield, no. That was the end of Armstid. Guess a friend helping him. Alright, that was the end of that one. I got 50 pages left.